we do a mini-series on the love revolution and the way that the good news of the gospel is meant to be encapsulated with this love for God, for each other, for our enemies. And that is the motivation to take the good news into all the world. Jesus is about to go to his death, and he's keen that his followers remember him. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that Jesus gives them a way of remembering him. And he gives them bread and wine and says, whenever you eat this, whenever you drink this, do it and remember me. And in the church, it's become sort of service that we tack on from time to time, and I guess that's fine. And in the church history, it's become it's got joined with baptism and has become a sacrament, an idea that it's by the bread and the wine and through the baptism that we receive God's grace, that we receive his energy, his life, his power, that we receive favour from God. In some churches, they have more than 2 sacraments, but in the Protestant church, we just have 2 because we reckon that the Bible has 2, although maybe it's got 3 really. But anyway, we'll come on to that in a bit, maybe. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this meal, and I love the fact that it's a meal, and I love the fact it's a simple meal because you don't have to agree with the people that you eat with, but you can eat with them. And I think that's wonderful. It's not an expensive meal. It's bread and wine, so you don't have to be rich to partake of the remembering Jesus bit. It's not particularly complicated. Doesn't matter who you are. You can take bread and wine. You can be part of this. You can remember together with Jesus. And in the Old Testament, they had circumcision. In the New Testament, we have a new covenant, Jesus called it, bread and wine. And I have to say, I think bread and wine is a lot better. Interestingly, at least I think it's interesting, John doesn't mention Jesus' baptism, and he doesn't mention bread and wine. It seems that John wasn't so interested in the sacraments, wasn't quite so interested in these means of grace. When Jesus said, a new covenant, this is the new covenant in my blood, John skips that bit, which is surprising, really, because he was there. I mean, if it's the same John, and I think it probably was, then he was leaning against Jesus as Jesus takes the bread and wine and says. So it is a bit surprising. But in John chapter 6, we get the idea that John is probably less interested in the symbols and more interested in the reality, the spiritual reality of feeding on Christ. In John chapter 6, he says, what I want you to do, Jesus says, what I want you to do is feed on me. I'm the bread of life. What I want you to do is drink on me and you'll never thirst again, he says in another place. And John wants us to be more connected with God directly, more intimately connected with him. So we're feeding on him, we're drawing on him, we're receiving from him rather than through the symbols. What he does do at the Last Supper isn't give them a new covenant. John records something else Jesus said at that meal, which Matthew, Mark, Luke don't record. He talks about a new commandment. Jesus gives us a new covenant, and instead of circumcision, we've got bread and wine. The old covenant was founded really on the 10 commandments. That's how you kept the covenant. Keep covenant with me. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In the New Testament, Jesus gives us a new commandment. And the new commandment is not don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, it's love one another. Love one another. Love one another. My children, I'll be with you only a little longer. You'll look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so now I tell you, where I'm going, you can't come. Verse 34 of John 13, a new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And then Simon Peter changes the subject. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? Yeah, thank you, Simon. Well, that's all right. I don't need that bit. We've deleted this from the Bible. And, thank you. One simple command. Love one another. I have two problems with this. I don't know how many problems you have with it, but I have two problems with this command. And problem number one is that it's too wide. It includes too many different people. When Jesus gave bread and wine, he instituted this idea that we can eat together. And I don't know about you, but there's quite a few churches I'm not allowed to take bread and wine in, which seems odd to me somehow. But then maybe they think I'm odd. I don't know why it is, but because I haven't, gone through the ceremonies or I haven't got the letter or whatever, I'm not allowed to take bread and wine in their churches. And that somehow seems wrong to me. Paul says, you should examine yourself. It's not for other people to examine you. Examine yourself and then take the bread and drink the wine. And so it seems a shame to me that I can't take bread and wine. I joke about it with some priests and some others. There's other priests and others that you don't joke about it with, but there's some that I do joke about it with. And, it's all very good. But it's a shame. It seemed to me quite odd that the church is very good at excluding people. And Jesus gave the bread to Judas. So it seems to me he set the bar pretty low when it comes to who can share this table fellowship thing together. And the same's true about loving one another. That Jesus sets the bar pretty low as to who we're meant to love. And that's a problem. I mean, you're all great, but the 11 o'clock service... And the New Testament took this really seriously. The believers took it really seriously. The first reference we have to the life in the early church is they broke bread together in each other's homes. They were doing what Jesus said. 12 times this command to love one another is repeated in the New Testament. Got some of the references there. As we heard in the beginning, he gave us this command. We heard this from the beginning. You were taught of God, all of those, to love one another. One simple command. Love one another. And the problem is that Jesus calls all sorts of people to follow him. All sorts of people. And expected them to love one another. James and John were brothers. Don't know how you get on with your brother, but some people get on fine with their brothers, don't they? And it's easy to love them. Other people, their siblings fight like cats and dogs. It's just really difficult even to love your brother. There was a treacherous tax collector in the group, Matthew, also known as Levi, one of Jesus' special 12 followers. He worked with the enemy, collecting taxes for the Romans. And Jesus called him, and he made Simon the Zealot one of his disciples as well. Simon, who would gladly have killed Matthew. Jesus had some very rich followers, the rich young ruler, but most of his followers were very poor. Love one another. So some of Jesus' followers, like Mary of Magdala, had rather a checkered history and a difficult background. Others were very stable and righteous. Love one another. The early church had to work really hard to find a way for Jews and Gentiles, which was the great divide in that part of the Eastern world, how they could eat together, how they could fellowship together in the church. And we have a whole thing in Acts chapter 15, another whole thing in Ephesians chapter 3 about how God has brought us together so that we can love one another despite our differences. They found that the dividing wall of hostility has been broken down in Jesus so that we can love one another. Paul says we're being built together into a temple in which God lives by his Spirit. As we love one another, as we're drawn together into something that looks more like the dwelling place of God, because God loves it when people love one another. That's why he likes marriage so much. That's why he says when 2 or 3 are together in my name, I'm there. Love one another. It's hard to love Christians who are different from you with any sort of love that looks like Jesus. And I don't mean people who necessarily look different from you. That can be hard, and I'm blessed to be part of a church where people who look different from each other do seem to love one another, and thank you for your part in that, and that's such a wonderful thing, and I think it's glorious, and particularly in these days I think it's wonderfully prophetic and a great statement to the nation. But it's much harder for me to love people who think differently from me, the people that I don't agree with, which frankly is most people, I've found. And that's hard, isn't it? It's hard when people think differently to you. It's hard to love them. And I think, on reflection, it's good that we're different, isn't it? I think there's something slightly, I mean, I love the reference to the Olympics, but I do find there's something slightly disturbing about synchronized swimming. Why would you? Sorry, no, move on, Neil, quick, before you offend people. I mean, there were a few odd things, weren't there, about the opening ceremony of the French Olympics, but I did find the Chinese one far more disturbing 16 years ago, when everybody was exactly the same. And there's something glorious about the differences that we have, but sometimes that pushes us to a point where it's hard to love one another. The early church really had to work hard on all of this. It's hard when we disagree. When one person's interpretation of Christianity is so different from ours that it's barely recognizable. For a few years, I prayed regularly. Let me rephrase that. I prayed religiously that God would take away any religious thing in me. And I was intent on pursuing relationship with Jesus. I was intent on being genuine and authentic. And I wanted to, not a mere formality in any area of my life. I wanted to be a non-religious Christian, a non-religious follower of Jesus. And it does make it hard when you go into some churches and attend some meetings that just feel very religious. And love one another. Love one another. A few years ago, at the height of the Cold War, there was a church movement that promoted what they called a modest proposal for peace. Let the Christians of the world agree they will not kill each other. And that would be helpful, wouldn't it? It'd be really helpful. Just think about conflicts in Europe. That would be really helpful. You know, current ones and previous ones. But it's hard to love the people in the church down the road too, because they've just got it wrong. Doesn't this command mean that relationship trumps being right? That right relationship is more important than right belief. I mean, how many of us haven't changed what we believe in the last month? No, 20 years? How many of us really believe the same thing that the person who brought us to Jesus believes? How many of us really, because relationship's far more important than being right. Of course, truth is important, but it's not the most important. Jesus didn't say, did he, that they'll know you are Christians by the way that you state your belief system. They'll know by your love. Let us love one another. It's hard to do relationship from a distance, isn't it? It's hard. I think it's good to read books and articles you don't agree with. I think it's important to expose yourself to someone else's point of view. I believe it's important, but that's best done by talking, by sitting down, by listening, by communicating, by simply respecting, by living with people who perhaps we don't agree with. Love one another as I have loved you. It's a problem. It's difficult because it's far too wide. My second problem, and the second reason that it's so difficult, is it's far too deep. Jesus said, by this you will all people know you are my followers if you love one another. If you love one another as I have loved you. And he'd just washed their feet. Just before the meal, Jesus had got them together, and Jesus had, in a disgusting act, taken the place of the lowest servant and washed their feet. And then he says, love one another as I have loved you. There was a guy in our church a few years ago who was an army captain or a major or something. Big anyway. I think maybe both a captain and a major at different points. And he spent a lot of time with the TAs. The TAs are the people who go camping with guns every weekend, one weekend a month. And so he spent a lot of time with the TAs. And he told me, I said, did you have a good weekend last weekend? He said, yeah. He said, we took them on this route march, which never sounds like a good weekend to me, but apparently get a big pack on your back and off you trek. It's like Duke of Edinburgh on steroids. It's that sort of thing. You've got this huge pack, you're marching for ages, and you get to set up camp. And he said, and then, while they're all exhausted, I undid someone's boots and took off their shoes, took off their socks, and then I washed their feet. And so they went around the group and washed all of their feet. And as he did that, he had opportunity, of course, to tell them about Jesus, to tell them about his hero and his example. Love one another. You can make a good argument, I think, that this foot washing thing is actually a sacrament. That Jesus commanded it, it's a means of grace, it's a means of blessing, and probably should be part of our church service like communion and baptism. I have to say, if that gets instituted here, then I probably will find another church. But I do think it's so important. Not to wash one another's feet, but to love as I have loved you. Love one another as I have loved you. And that was what was so attractive about the early church. They took this so seriously. They were committed to encouraging one another and eating and meeting together and sharing resources and praying for one another and encouraging one another. And it meant that there was male and female, young and old, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile together, loving one another because they realized that Jesus had loved them and they were seeking to love one another in the same way. It was this foot washing thing, I don't know if it ever became part of the church. I really don't. But that level of love and respect and care for one another certainly did. By this will all people know you are my followers, if you love one another as I have loved you. It wasn't long after the crucifixion that the disciples realized that Jesus didn't die just because the Jewish leaders had it in for him. That he didn't die just because the Roman soldiers were particularly cruel. He didn't die just because Judas betrayed Jesus. He didn't die even because Satan entered Judas and pushed him to do that. He didn't die because people betrayed Jesus. They realized pretty quickly that Jesus died for them. That Jesus died for me. They realized pretty quickly that Jesus loved them so much that he died for them. Love one another as I have loved you. I think it's good to be reminded. It's just important, isn't it, to be reminded that at the core of our faith, there's a commitment to love one another as Jesus loved us. It's hard to love people when they're still sinners. It's hard to love people who mess up. It's hard to love people who hurt us. It's hard to love people who betray us. It's hard to love people who are estranged from us. It's hard to love people when they become enemies. It's hard to love people when they become distant. It's hard to love people when they let us down. It's hard to love people when they stab us in the back. It's hard to love us when they betray us or deny us. Love one another, Jesus says, as I have loved you. Sometimes it's just important, isn't it, to remind ourselves that at the core of following Jesus is not what we believe or how we pray, but a new commandment to love one another. And somehow I need to get over my two big problems with this. That it's too wide and too deep. Lord, help us. Let's pray. Shall we stand?